There is a moment in the quiet of a vault when money stops being coins and starts being power. It is a silent, dangerous alchemy. And in the 15th century, in a city boiling with ambition and piety, one family mastered this art. They were not kings, not warriors, not popes. They were bankers. And from their ledgers, they didn't just fund a new world. They invented the very economic engine that would build it. Our story begins not with a crown, but with a ledger, a simple book of parchment and ink. But in the hands of the Medici, this book became a weapon. Florence was a city of cloth and commerce, a republic nominally, but in truth a battleground for wealthy families. The Medici were wool traders, respectable, but not yet extraordinary. They saw what others did not, that the true wealth of Europe was trapped, frozen in place by the church's ban on usury and by the sheer physical danger of moving gold across a continent of bandits and warring kingdoms. So they began to weave a web not of silk, but of credit. Their first and most brilliant stroke was to develop a system of double-entry bookkeeping. It sounds mundane, a dry accounting term, but imagine the power of truly knowing for the first time where every single florin had gone. Profit and loss laid bare. It was the difference between guessing the stars and having a map of the heavens. This clarity was their secret sight. Their second innovation was the bill of exchange. A merchant in Bruges could deposit gold with the Medici agent. He would receive a letter of credit. He could then travel to Venice, to Rome, to London, and present that letter to another Medici agent who would pay him in local currency. No gold was moved, no bandits were risked. The Medici took a fee, of course, but the cost was a fraction of the risk. They had, in effect, created the first international wire service. And in doing so, they made money fluid. But their greatest asset was not a financial instrument. It was the church itself. The papacy was the wealthiest institution in the world, with tithes and taxes flowing to Rome from every corner of Christendom. Managing this torrent of money was a logistical nightmare. The Medici made themselves indispensable. They became the bankers to God's own treasurer. They handled the vast revenues, financed the Pope's armies, and managed his debts. With a flick of a pen in a Florentine counting house, they could empower a cardinal or bankrupt an enemy. This was power of a kind never before seen, invisible, financial, and absolute. And with this power, they bought the future. Look at Florence. See it not just as a city of stone, but as a city of receipts. Every dome, every fresco, every sculpture that would come to define the Renaissance was, on some level, an entry in a Medici ledger. Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch, was a man torn between the sin of usury and the desire for salvation. And so he poured the profits of his bank into the one thing that could cleanse them: beauty. He funded Brunelleschi's dome, that impossible marvel of engineering that crowned the Florence Cathedral. He became the patron of Donatello, of Fra Angelico. He built libraries and churches. It was philanthropy as public relations, art as divine apology. The bank financed the glory, and the glory legitimized the bank. For a time, the system was perfect. The family's influence stretched across Europe. Their agents were in every major capital. Their currency was trust, and their army was composed of debtors. One grandson, Lorenzo, would become known as the Magnificent. He was the peak of this fusion of power. He ruled Florence from the shadows, a banker prince who hosted philosophers and poets in his palace, while his agents manipulated markets and his artists, like a young, ambitious Michelangelo, gave form to the new humanist spirit. The Renaissance was in full, glorious bloom, and the Medici were its gardeners.
But the very mechanisms that built their empire contained the seeds of its decay. The branches, spread far and wide, became difficult to control. Ambitious managers in distant cities made risky loans to kings and princes, loans that were almost impossible to collect. The Medici, reliant on the speed of information that was, by our standards, agonizingly slow, often discovered these disasters too late. The family itself began to lose its mercantile edge, becoming more focused on political power and aristocratic titles than on the meticulous details of the ledger. And then there was the backlash. A zealous Dominican friar, preaching fire and brimstone from the pulpit, railed against the corruption of wealth, against the vanity of their art, against the sin of their usury. The people, squeezed by taxes and stirred by this fiery rhetoric, turned on the family. They were expelled. Their palace was looted. For a moment, it seemed the era of the banker prince was over. They would return, of course. They would become dukes and even popes. But the bank, the magnificent engine that had funded their ascent, was gone. It had collapsed under the weight of its own ambition and bad debt. The Medici name would live on in the annals of European royalty, but the true source of their power, that brilliant, ruthless, innovative financial machine, was already a memory. So, what are we to make of their legacy? The Medici did not merely fund the Renaissance, they created the economic soil in which it could grow. They turned banking from a disreputable trade into a sophisticated force that could shape continents. They demonstrated that capital, when mobilized with intelligence and daring, can be a greater catalyst for change than any army. The art, the architecture, the very intellectual awakening we so revere, it was all built on a foundation of credit and interest. But the story of the Medici is also a timeless warning. It is a tale of the delicate balance between creation and corruption, between funding masterpieces and financing tyranny. They remind us that every economic revolution has its architects, men who see the world not for what it is, but for what it could be if money were made to flow differently. They were the bankers who bought the Renaissance, and in doing so, they showed us that the most powerful currency in the world is not gold, but an idea.